This is the World Cup. It's the most watched sporting event in the world with 3.5 billion viewers. That's almost half the world, coming together to enjoy this tournament. Such a huge event costs a lot of money to make it happen. Every 4 years, a different country is chosen to host the tournament, and this year's tournament is hosted in Qatar, the first Arab and Middle Eastern country to host the World Cup. The media is reporting that this World Cup in Qatar cost the hosts $220 billion. From building stadiums to metro tunnels, this World Cup is 15 times more expensive than the previous one in 2018 hosted by Russia. However, this number is far from accurate, and the truth behind the actual cost of this World Cup requires a deeper dive into the exact spendings. So why is Qatar actually excited to host this event aside from tourism exposure? How much is Qatar making from this event? How did a small country like Qatar win the right to host the biggest sporting event in the world? Stay tuned and we will go over the economics of this World Cup in this week's video. If you like videos like this, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to see similar upcoming content. In December 2, 2010, all eyes were in Zurich. FIFA announced the winner of the host of World Cup of 2018 and 2022. The 2018 edition was won by Russia and the 2022 edition was won by Qatar, beating the US to become the first Arab country to host the tournament. Qatar had successfully submitted a strong bid to FIFA to convince them of their readiness of hosting the event. The most challenging part for Qatar, however, was the actual costs of hosting such a huge event watched by billions around the world. The most important criteria in hosting the World Cup is the infrastructure of the host country. FIFA has strict guidelines regarding the infrastructure, stadiums, hotels, telecommunication networks and other critical services. The host country must prepare all this according to FIFA's guidelines before the start of the World Cup. When Qatar submitted their bid to host the World Cup, they didn't have most of the needed infrastructure for such an event. But they submitted very ambitious plans on building projects that will be ready by 2022. There are two types of infrastructure that Qatar focused on. The first type are the projects that are directly related to the World Cup, like the stadiums and training facilities, and the other type are the projects that are strictly related to the World Cup. And these are the projects that would have been done regardless if Qatar would have hosted the World Cup or not, because these are essential projects that the country needs to develop, like roads and telecommunications. Regarding the first type of infrastructure, the Qataris mentioned to FIFA that they will build 9 new stadiums and improve 3 existing stadiums, bringing the total to 12 stadiums ready to host the World Cup. This isn't an odd practice. When South Korea and Japan hosted the World Cup in 1996, they pledged to FIFA that they will provide a total of 20 stadiums, in which 17 of them weren't built yet. The Qataris revised their terms with FIFA and the new number of stadiums went down to 8 only instead of 12 in hopes of reducing costs. Qatar was looking to receive millions of fans for the duration of the World Cup. A country with only 3 million people, Qatar has to make sure that their infrastructure is good enough to receive such a huge influx of people at once, or else the country will crash down. That's why Qatar had to improve their infrastructure to a world-class standard. The infrastructure needed massive improvements and the World Cup fast-forwarded many projects. The Qataris started planning for this development since 2008, which was 2 years before they submitted their bid to host the World Cup. So what is going on? If we look into the bid evaluation report that Qatar submitted to FIFA in 2010, it mentions Qatar's National Vision 2030 twice. This vision is a massive development plan that the Qatari government launched in 2008. This vision targets environmental, social and economic development. So what does this vision has to do with the World Cup? Why did Qatar mention it in their bid to host the World Cup? In short, the Qataris, in their attempt to convince FIFA to host the World Cup, said that this national vision was going to change the country's front and will make it more than able to host such a mega event. And this link was one of the main reasons Qatar won the bid to host the World Cup. What matters the most to FIFA is the country's infrastructure. Going forward, the Vision 2030 that started in 2008 and the World Cup that the Qataris started preparing for since 2010, became linked side by side. Even though the Vision 2030 plan had 22 years for preparation, the World Cup was only 12 years away. Therefore, a huge part of the 2030 infrastructure projects was rushed because of the World Cup. There has been different estimates for the costs related to these projects, but we can use some of the figures used by Bloomberg. One of the biggest and most important infrastructure projects was Lusail City. Lusail is a new city that was built north of the capital Doha. With only 38 kilometers squared in land area, it can occupy around 450,000 people. It has an electric tram and the newly built Lusail Stadium fits 80,000 fans. This city alone cost $45 billion. Other than Lusail, there's the Metro Doha project, which is a network of inner-city trains that connects Doha with nearby cities. This project cost $36 billion. Another crucial project was the expansion and development of Doha's airport to prepare for 58 million traveler per year. This cost the Qataris $15.5 billion. Another project was the Hamad Harbour that opened in 2017 with a capacity of receiving 7.5 million containers a year. This harbour has cost the Qataris $7.4 billion. Doha's city centre also had massive overhauls that cost $4.5 billion. Many other business sectors also cost around $3.2 billion to develop and grow. That's not all. If we look at the roads in Qatar, we will see that in between 2013 and 2022, they built 1,791 kilometers of roads, 207 bridges, and 143 tunnels. This is of course alongside many other projects in the tourism, education, health and entertainment sectors. The total cost of all of these infrastructure projects brings us to the famous number of $220 billion. This number is not only for stadiums and World Cup related expenses, however many media outlets use this number as the direct operational cost of hosting the World Cup. This budget is being repeatedly compared to the previous budgets of the World Cup, but the comparison is flawed. To explain why this comparison is flawed, the best example here would be the 2022 Olympics hosted in China. The Chinese government announced that the cost of hosting this event was $3.9 billion, which would make it the lowest operational cost for the Olympics for the last 20 years. But an investigation made by the Insider reports that this tournament has cost China at least $38.5 billion. The difference is huge. The truth is, both numbers are correct. It really depends on how you measure the cost of hosting these mega events. Do you only take into account the direct costs related to the event, such as stadiums, sport complexes and other related operational costs? Or do you also include the infrastructure projects that are being built to support the tournament? China argued that many of the infrastructure projects were already underway before they were selected to host the Olympics, and that's why they didn't include some infrastructure projects into the total cost of hosting the Olympics. This is why there's a great discrepancy between figures like this, because it's all about perspective. Regardless on what you think Qatar has spent so far for the World Cup, it is still a lot more than what Qatar is expected to earn, which is only a mere $17 billion. Qatar's bid to host the World Cup was not for financial gains or tourism exposure, but instead it was to push for soft power. For almost 3 years, Qatar was in a diplomatic crisis with the surrounding Gulf countries. These countries, led by Saudi Arabia, severed ties with Qatar in 2017 over unfounded claims of Qatar supporting terrorism. Qatar was banned from using airspace, sea routes and land crossings. Qatar started rerouting their exports and imports to nearby countries in order to sustain their economy, in which they were successfully doing. It's these kinds of threats is what Qatar considers a threat to their existence. Hosting the most watched event in the world really puts their name on the map. Everyone now hears and reads Qatar because of the World Cup. Let me know in the comments section if you think that this World Cup put Qatar on the map.